The hall of presentation was designed to make candidates look magnificent, which it accomplished through the architectural strategy of providing a backdrop so deliberately restrained that anything standing in front of it became the most visually significant object in the room. The walls were dark crystalline stone, polished to a reflective depth that doubled the hall's light sources without competing with them. The floor was the same stone, its surface carrying the faint bioluminescent veining that characterized Calithi ceremonial architecture, lines of deep blue light that traced geometric patterns across the ground, and that pulsed at a frequency calibrated to produce, in Calithi physiology, a subtle state of heightened aesthetic receptivity, which was the architect's polite way of saying the floor was designed to make you think everything you saw was more impressive than it actually was. The candidates were impressive without the floor's assistance. 47 individuals from 11 species, each selected by their civilization's diplomatic apparatus as the finest representative they could offer for potential bonding with the Calithi imperial household. They stood in the hall's presentation array, a semicircular formation that positioned each candidate at optimal viewing distance from the imperial dais. And they were, by any objective assessment, an extraordinary collection of beings. The Calithi warrior nobles occupied the formation's center. Because host species candidates were traditionally given prominence, and because the warrior nobles were genetically enhanced to a degree that made prominence redundant, they would have commanded attention from any position in any room. Their physiology representing 8 centuries of selective biological refinement that had produced warriors averaging 6'4" with sensory architecture, musculature, and reflexive capability that exceeded baseline biology by measurable and significant margins. They were beautiful in the way that engineered things were beautiful, precise, optimized, every proportion calculated for maximum impact. The Selvari diplomatic specialists flanked them, their species' natural charisma augmented by cultural training that made every gesture purposeful and every expression calibrated. The Moltari tactical officers stood in disciplined formation, their combat records communicated through the ceremonial honors displayed on their uniforms. Representatives from 8 other allied species completed the array, each one the product of their civilization's careful selection process, each one presenting the implicit argument that they were what an imperial consort should be: capable, distinguished, worthy. Princess Valith Sorkin sat on the selection dais with the composed attention of someone who was taking the process seriously, while finding the process itself deeply tedious, a combination that her mother recognized from the dais's elevated position, and that she attributed to the genetic contribution of Valith's late father, who had possessed the same capacity for simultaneous engagement and impatience, and who had expressed it with the same slight tension at the corners of his mouth that Valith was displaying now. Valith was 26 by Calithi developmental equivalents, an age that mapped to early adulthood, and that the rite of selection recognized as the threshold where the imperial heir was expected to choose a consort whose presence would complement, strengthen, and extend the household's capability. She was tall, 5'11", with the lean, angular build that characterized Calithi royal lineage. Her skin was pale silver blue, lighter than her mother's deep twilight tones, carrying the translucent luminosity that indicated youth within the imperial bloodline. Her eyes were violet silver, sharp and analytical, possessing the enhanced pupil architecture that gave her species its famous visual acuity, and that she deployed during the presentation, with the systematic thoroughness of someone who was not merely observing the candidates, but evaluating them against criteria that she had not shared with her advisory staff, because her advisory staff's criteria and her criteria were, she suspected, different in ways that would produce arguments she did not want to have before making her decision. Her hair was dark copper, arranged in the formal style that the rite required, elaborate, architectural, woven with the bioluminescent threads that indicated imperial status. Along her temples, bioluminescent patterns shifted in the controlled silver blue of analytical assessment, the chromatic signature of a mind processing large amounts of information and withholding judgment until processing was complete. She watched the candidates. She watched them with the patience that her position required and the discernment that her intelligence provided, and she found, in 47 exceptional specimens from 11 species, nothing that interested her. Then she saw the human with the relay. Cole Renton was not a candidate. He was a communications specialist attached to the human delegation's technical support team, present in the hall of presentation, because the human ambassador's translation equipment had developed a synchronization fault during the ceremony's preliminary phase, and someone needed to fix it. And that someone was Cole, because fixing things was what Cole did, and because no one else on the technical team had been willing to enter the ceremonial hall during the rite to perform the repair. On the grounds that entering the hall of presentation during a royal selection ceremony to fiddle with a relay was the kind of cultural misstep that the Diplomatic Services Protocol Manual covered extensively in its section on things not to do. Cole had read the protocol manual. He had also assessed the synchronization fault, determined that it would degrade the ambassador's translation capability within 20 minutes, and concluded that a non-functional translator during a diplomatic ceremony would produce a worse cultural misstep than a technician quietly fixing the problem in a corner. This kind of practical prioritization characterized his approach to most situations. Assess the options, determine which option minimizes harm, execute the option regardless of whether it aligned with procedures that were written by people who hadn't anticipated the specific situation. He was positioned at the hall's far periphery, behind the human delegation seating, crouched beside the translation relay housing with its access panel removed and its internal components exposed. He was 31. He was not tall, 5'10", medium build, carrying the lean, functional physique of someone whose body had been maintained through habit rather than intention. His hair was dark, slightly too long, falling across his forehead in a way that he pushed back absently when it interfered with his sightline to the relay's interior. His eyes were dark blue, steady, focused, carrying a quality of attention that was more intense than his otherwise unremarkable appearance suggested, as though the eyes belonged to someone more alert than the rest of the face indicated, and had been asked to modulate their intensity to match the gentler expression surrounding them. His face was pleasant without being notable. Even features, a jaw that was defined but not dramatic, an expression of mild concentration that was his default state, and that conveyed, to casual observation, the impression of someone whose primary engagement with the world was technical, and whose emotional register operated in the middle range, without the peaks and valleys that more expressive faces displayed. He looked like an engineer. He looked like exactly what his personnel file said he was, a communications specialist with a background in systems architecture and a professional history that was competent, unremarkable, and thoroughly boring. His hands, working inside the relay housing, moved with a precision that was notable if you were watching closely enough to notice it. Each motion economical, each component handled with the exact force required and no more. The physical vocabulary of someone whose fine motor control had been developed to a level that exceeded the requirements of relay repair by a considerable margin. He disassembled the faulty synchronization module, identified the misaligned frequency coupler, corrected the alignment with a micro-adjustment tool, and reassembled the module in a sequence so fluid that it appeared practiced rather than improvised, which it was not. He had never worked on this specific relay model before, but his hands understood the architecture of complex systems at a level that transcended specific experience, and operated on principles that applied to any system regardless of its purpose. He was not aware that the princess was watching him. He was not aware of anything beyond the relay and the immediate environment, which he had assessed upon entering the hall with the automatic thoroughness that he would have described, if asked, as a habit, noting the exits, the sightlines, the structural characteristics of the space, the movement patterns of the security personnel, the positions of the ventilation access points, and the load-bearing architecture of the ceiling, all in approximately 4 seconds, all without conscious intention, all filed in a layer of awareness that operated below his active attention, and that provided, without being consulted, a continuous situational map that updated itself in real time. He would have been surprised to learn that this was not how everyone experienced rooms. Valith watched him for 11 minutes. She watched his hands disassemble and reassemble the relay with a fluency that spoke not of training, but of understanding. The comprehension of systems that went beyond knowing what the components did to understanding why they were arranged as they were, what the design intended, and where the design's intention and its execution diverged. She watched his concentration, total, absorbed, directed at the broken thing before him, with an attention that excluded the spectacle of 47 candidates competing for her future and that found, in a malfunctioning translator relay, something more worthy of engagement. She made her selection. The court's reaction was not subtle. Calithi diplomatic training provided tools for managing surprise, but the tools were designed for the kind of surprise that diplomatic events typically produced: unexpected proposals, unfavorable treaty terms, the occasional breach of protocol, and the princess choosing an uncredentialed human technician over 47 curated specimens from 11 allied species exceeded the parameters that the tools were designed for, producing visible responses that ranged from the advisory council's coordinated expression of controlled alarm to the warrior noble candidate's rigid, frozen composure that their training maintained over whatever their actual responses were. Cole's reaction was the most notable for its inadequacy. He was escorted from the relay housing to the ceremonial dais by a protocol officer whose expression communicated that this situation was not in the manual, and he stood before the princess with the translation relay's micro-adjustment tool still in his right hand, and an expression of polite confusion that his face produced when his brain was processing a situation it had not been given context for. "You've been selected," the protocol officer said. "Selected for what?" "As the princess's consort." Cole looked at the protocol officer. He looked at the princess. He looked at the micro-adjustment tool in his hand. He processed the information with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to new data, evaluating it against his existing understanding of the situation, and produced the only response his assessment could generate. "I was fixing a relay." "Yes, the princess observed you. She has made her selection. You are the chosen consort." "I'm a communications specialist." "You are the chosen consort." Cole's dark blue eyes found Valith's violet silver, ones across the ceremonial distance, and the expression on his face was not the composed gratitude that the ceremony's protocols assumed the selected consort would display, but the genuine, unperformed bewilderment of a man who had entered a room to repair a piece of equipment and was leaving it engaged to royalty, and whose professional training had not included a module covering this specific transition. Valith's bioluminescent patterns shifted, a warm pulse of violet that her advisory staff had never seen during a selection ceremony, and that they would later identify, after consulting the chromatic reference archives, as the Calithi expression of finding something unexpectedly and genuinely delightful. She was delighted, not by his credentials or his capabilities or his political value, but by the expression on his face, which was honest and confused and entirely absent of the calculated response that every other candidate in the room would have produced. And the honesty was what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it, until she found it in a man crouched behind a translation relay with a tool in his hand. Empress Salith Vorkeen held the private council in her intelligence chamber 2 hours after the selection ceremony, and the atmosphere of the meeting carried the particular quality of a room, where everyone present understood that the conversation's content would reshape their understanding of the situation they were managing. The Intelligence Directorate occupied 3 chairs along the chamber's consultation table. Director Thalen Vordave, the Directorate's chief, was a career intelligence professional whose 40 years of service had given him a face that revealed exactly as much as he intended, and an understanding of classified information that operated in layers, each layer of clearance revealing a more complete picture, and each picture more concerning than the last. The human, Cole Renton, Thalen began, activating a display that showed Cole's official personnel file, the sanitized version, the one that described a communications specialist with a background in systems architecture and a professional history so unremarkable that it practically begged to be investigated. His public records are clean: engineering degree from the Meridian Technical Institute, 6 years of communication systems work with the Human Diplomatic Technical Service, standard clearances, no military background listed. No military background listed, the Empress repeated, and the emphasis she placed on the final word communicated to everyone in the room that she had read the next layer. Thalen advanced the display. The sanitized file was replaced by a document bearing classification headers from 3 separate intelligence services, each one indicating a clearance level that existed above the thresholds most senior officials ever encountered. Cole Renton, born Callum Renton, designation CR 7714, formerly of the United Earth Contingency Response Division, Psychological Warfare and Threat Suppression Program. Specifically, Thalen's voice maintained its professional flatness, but the deliberate care with which he chose his next words indicated that even after 40 years of intelligence work, some information required careful handling. Specifically, the Warform Initiative. The council chamber processed this with the weighted silence of people who knew what the Warform Initiative was, and who were recalibrating their assessment of the gentle human who had been holding a micro-adjustment tool and looking confused. The Warform program was one of humanity's most classified military projects from the frontier conflicts, a program that took psychologically suitable candidates and converted them, through a combination of neural conditioning, reflexive architecture implementation, and perceptual enhancement, into operatives whose capabilities were not physical augmentation but cognitive weaponization. Warforms were not stronger or faster than standard humans. They were more aware. Their perceptual systems were enhanced to process environmental data at speeds and depths that exceeded normal human cognition by orders of magnitude. Threat assessment, structural analysis, vulnerability identification, tactical positioning, all operating simultaneously, continuously, and critically below conscious awareness. A warform did not decide to assess a room for threats. A warform assessed every room for threats, automatically, the way a human heart beat automatically, because the assessment architecture was embedded in neural pathways that operated below voluntary control. The program produced operatives who were, by all external measures, ordinary people. Gentle, unremarkable, possessing no visible capability that would distinguish them from any other human in any room, and who were simultaneously the most dangerous beings in that room, because their unconscious cognitive architecture was continuously identifying every threat, every vulnerability, every tactical option available in their environment. And their reflexive response systems, the deep neural pathways that connected perception to action, were capable of activating with a speed and precision that made the gap between threat detection and threat neutralization functionally instantaneous. The program was decommissioned after the frontier conflicts. The operatives were deconditioned, subjected to behavioral overlay programs that suppressed the conscious access to their capabilities and embedded the gentle, non-threatening demeanor that allowed post-conflict integration into civilian life. The deconditioning was effective at the surface level. It produced people who genuinely experienced themselves as calm, gentle, unremarkable. It could not reach the deep neural architecture because the deep neural pathways had been embedded below the threshold that behavioral conditioning could access. The Warform's threat assessment ran continuously. The Warform's tactical positioning operated on autopilot. The Warform's protective reflexes remained intact, dormant, waiting for stimulus that would activate them through pathways that the deconditioning had not touched because it could not reach them. His deconditioning was classified as successful, Thalen said. He experiences himself as a civilian communications specialist. His engineering skills are genuine. The post-service retraining program provided real technical education. He has no conscious awareness of his war-form architecture. He does not know what he was. But the architecture remains, the empress said, intact, operational, running continuously beneath his conscious awareness. His habit of checking exits, assessing structural vulnerabilities, positioning himself in tactical geometries, these are not habits. They are war-form baseline operations. He cannot stop doing them because he does not know he is doing them. The Empress's bioluminescent patterns shifted, a slow, deliberate movement of deep indigo and gold that her intelligence directorate recognized as sovereign assessment, the chromatic signature of a mind evaluating strategic options with the full weight of imperial calculation. My daughter chose him because he was gentle, focused, and honest, Salith said. She does not know what he is. No, she chose a man who she believes is a kind, intelligent engineer whose attention to broken things reflects a mind she wants in her life. Yes, and she is correct. He is all of those things. The Empress paused. He is also, beneath the conditioning and the civilian overlay and the engineering degree, one of the most sophisticated protective assets humanity has ever produced, and he has been unconsciously threat assessing every environment he has entered since the moment he arrived on this planet. Also, yes, she chose a caring partner, I approve a guardian, and the human is both without knowing he is either. The Empress's patterns settled into the deep gold of formal sovereign decision. The selection stands. Monitor him. Do not interfere. And do not, under any circumstances, allow my daughter to access this intelligence level. Cole moved into the imperial household with the bewildered compliance of a man whose life had changed so fundamentally that the only available strategy was to proceed as though the change made sense, and to trust that comprehension would eventually catch up with circumstances. He was given quarters adjacent to the princess's wing. He was given access to the household's technical systems, because Valeth had noted his skills during the selection and had arranged for his expertise to be utilized rather than wasted, a decision that her advisory staff found baffling and that Cole found reassuring, because it meant he could continue doing work that made sense even if the rest of his situation did not. He fixed things. The imperial household contained an abundance of things to fix: communication systems, environmental controls, structural monitors, the complex technological infrastructure that supported a palace, designed for a civilization whose engineering philosophy prioritized elegance over accessibility, and whose maintenance staff therefore spent a disproportionate amount of time trying to repair systems whose beautiful design made their internal components difficult to reach. Cole navigated the infrastructure with the systematic competence that characterized his approach to all technical work, and the household staff developed, over the first weeks, the particular regard that people developed for someone who could solve problems they had been struggling with, and who did so without condescension or fanfare. Valeth watched him integrate. She watched with the attentiveness of a woman who had made an unconventional choice and who was discovering with each passing day that the choice was better than she had known. He listened, not with the performative attention that court figures deployed, the careful, calculated listening that extracted useful information while conveying interest. Cole listened the way engineers listen to systems, with the patient, complete attention of someone trying to understand how something worked, what it needed, where the stress points were. When Valeth talked about the pressures of her position, Cole listened with the same focused engagement he applied to malfunctioning relays, and the parallel was not diminishing but elevating. He treated her problems with the same seriousness he treated every system's problems, which was to say completely, without dismissal, and with the implicit assumption that understanding was the first step toward resolution. He was gentle. The gentleness was pervasive. It existed in the way he handled tools, the way he spoke to household staff, the way his voice modulated when he talked to Valeth about something she found upsetting, dropping to a calm, even register that had the quality of a hand placed on a shaking surface. The gentleness appeared, to Valeth and to everyone who observed him, to be his fundamental nature, the core characteristic from which all his other qualities extended. The empress watched from the sovereign's remove and saw the gentleness for what it was. The behavioral architecture of the deconditioning program, layered over a foundation that was not gentle at all but that had been trained, conditioned, and overlaid until the foundation was invisible and the surface was all that anyone, including Cole himself, could see. She also saw the other things. The things that Valeth did not recognize because she had no framework for recognizing them and that the Empress's intelligence training made legible. Cole checked exits. Every room, every space, every environment he entered. The first 4 seconds were devoted to an assessment so rapid and so thorough that it completed itself before he sat down, before he spoke, before his conscious mind engaged with whatever the room's social context was. Exits, sightlines, structural features, movement patterns, threat vectors. The assessment was continuous and updated in real time, running beneath his conscious awareness like a heartbeat, and the results manifested in behaviors that everyone attributed to personality, and that were, in fact, operational. He positioned himself. When he walked with Valeth, he walked on her exposed side, the side facing open space, the side that a threat would approach from. He did this without thought, without intention, his body navigating the geometry of protection the way a compass navigated magnetic north. Automatically, inevitably, because the architecture that governed his spatial positioning relative to a person, he was bonded with operated on pathways that his deconditioning had not reached, and that his conscious mind interpreted as preference rather than protocol. His nervous habits were tactical baselines. The way his fingers tapped surfaces when he sat, not anxiety but tactile assessment of material composition, structural density, improvisational weapon potential. The way his eyes tracked movement in crowds, not curiosity but threat pattern recognition, operating at speeds his conscious mind could not process, and that manifested as a vague feeling of attention that he attributed to being observant rather than being programmed for detection. He was, without his knowledge or anyone else's awareness except the Empress's, the most comprehensive personal security system in the imperial household. Not because of what he could do, though what he could do, if the deep neural architecture activated, was considerable, but because of what he was doing, continuously, automatically, every moment of every day. Assessing every threat to the woman his unconscious protective architecture had identified as his primary, the person whose safety his deepest programming prioritized above all other considerations, including his own continued existence. The assassination attempt was timed for the Festival of Illumination, a seasonal celebration held in the imperial gardens, where the palace's bioluminescent flora was cultivated to produce its annual bloom. A spectacular event that drew the court into the garden's open spaces, and that required, for the celebration's visual effect, a reduction in artificial lighting that the palace security's chief had objected to, and that tradition had overridden, because the festival had been held in semi-darkness for 600 years, and stopping now would communicate that the current dynasty feared shadows, which was a political message the Empress was not willing to send. The gardens were crowded. The reduced lighting produced an atmosphere that was beautiful, and, from a security perspective, operationally challenging, bioluminescent flora casting shifting, colored illumination that degraded visual tracking, crowd density that limited movement and sightline management, and the open-air environment that expanded the threat perimeter beyond what interior security protocols were designed to cover. Cole walked through the gardens with Valeth, and his conscious experience of the evening was pleasant. The bioluminescent blooms were genuinely beautiful, the colors shifting through the Calithi spectrum, providing partial coverage of the approach vector that the crowd's movement pattern left open. His eyes, which Valeth experienced as attentive and which were attentive, were also scanning, continuous, methodical, tracking the motion of every individual in his peripheral field, and comparing their movement patterns against the baseline that his architecture had established during the first 4 minutes of the evening. The wrongness registered at 21:37 hours. It was not a conscious identification. It was a feeling, a shift in Cole's internal state that rose from the deep neural layer like a temperature change, like the feeling of weather shifting, a premonitory awareness that something in his environment had deviated from the baseline in a way that his deep architecture classified as significant. 3 individuals in the crowd were moving against the flow. Not dramatically, their movements were professional, calibrated to avoid the sharp directional changes that security training identified as threatening. But they were converging. Their trajectories, when projected forward, intersected at a point that was approximately 4 meters from Valeth's current position, and the convergence was timed to reach intersection in approximately 90 seconds. Cole did not know any of this consciously. What he experienced was the feeling of wrongness, followed by the impulse, unexamined, automatic, rising from the architecture that governed his behavior in situations his conscious mind could not process quickly enough to move. He took Valeth's arm. The gesture was gentle, consistent with the persona that his conditioning had built, and Valeth experienced it as her consort guiding her toward a particularly impressive bloom display he had noticed. What it actually was, what the architecture calculated and executed through the medium of a gentle touch, was a redirection that moved her 3 meters laterally, changing her position relative to the convergence point, and placing Cole's body between her and the approach vector that the 3 individuals were closing on. He positioned himself, not consciously, not with the deliberate, calculated motion of a trained operative executing a protection maneuver, with the instinctive, automatic precision of an architecture that had identified a threat and that responded by doing what it had been built to do, placing the asset between the threat and the principle, using the body as a barrier, occupying the space that the threat required access to, and denying that access through the simple, effective strategy of being there first. The attempt failed. It failed because the 3 operatives reached their convergence point and found not the princess but her consort, standing in the space they needed to access with his back to the bloom display, and his body oriented toward their approach. And the orientation was not aggressive. His expression was pleasant, his posture was relaxed, his conscious mind was genuinely enjoying the gardens, but the positioning was perfect. The geometry of a human body placed precisely where it needed to be to block access to the person behind it, and the operative's plan, which depended on approaching the princess from a specific vector through a specific gap in the crowd, encountered a gap that was no longer a gap, and a vector that terminated in a man who was looking at them with dark blue eyes that were steady and focused, and that carried, beneath the gentle surface expression, a quality that the operative's professional training recognized even if they could not name it, the quality of someone who was aware of them in a way that exceeded casual observation, and that suggested, without confirming, that continued approach would be inadvisable. They withdrew. Professional assessment, professional decision. The operational window had closed, the target was inaccessible, and the human standing in their path was generating a deterrent effect that their briefing had not anticipated, and that their training told them to respect even without understanding its source. Cole did not know what had happened. His conscious experience was that he had guided Valeth to look at a bloom display and that 3 people in the crowd had walked past without incident. The feeling of wrongness subsided. His deep architecture, having responded to the threat and observed the threat's withdrawal, downgraded its assessment and returned to baseline operations. Valeth experienced a pleasant evening. The empress, who had been observing from the pavilion through enhanced visual feeds that her security directorate maintained, experienced confirmation. The private disclosure happened the following morning, in the empress's personal chamber, between mother and daughter, without advisors or intelligence personnel present. Because what needed to be said was not a briefing but a conversation, and the conversation was about Valeth's consort and Valeth's safety, and the relationship between the two that Valeth did not know existed. Something happened last night, the empress said. Valeth was seated across from her mother, her bioluminescent patterns in the relaxed violet that she carried in private, the chromatic baseline of a woman in the one space where she did not need to perform composure. The festival was beautiful. Cole enjoyed the blooms. He has an interesting perspective on bioluminescent engineering. He was analyzing the root structures while everyone else was watching the colors. There was a threat last night. In the gardens, Valeth's patterns shifted, a sharp transition to the bright silver of alert. What kind of threat? An assassination attempt. 3 operatives approaching from the eastern crowd flow. Time to reach your position at 21:39. The security teams did not intercept. The operatives were inside the security perimeter. Their approach was designed to exploit the gap between the second and third rotation. Then how? Cole. Valeth stopped. Her violet-silver eyes focused on her mother with the analytical intensity that was her default cognitive mode. Cole moved me, I remember. He took my arm and guided me toward the cascade bloom display. He repositioned you. He moved you laterally out of the approach vector and placed himself between you and the threat. He did it 3 minutes before the operatives reached their convergence point. He did it without conscious awareness that he was doing it. That's not how would he. The empress held her daughter's gaze and made the decision she had been balancing since the selection ceremony. How much to reveal? Cole is not only what you believe him to be, Saleth said, choosing her words with the precision of a sovereign navigating the boundary between necessary truth and classified information. He is everything you believe him to be, gentle, intelligent, caring, the person whose attention to broken things reflects a mind you recognized as valuable and good. That is real. That is who he is. But beneath what he is, there is also what he was, and what he was produced capabilities that were suppressed but not removed. And those capabilities are why he moved you last night without knowing he was moving you. What was he? I cannot tell you the specifics. The classification exists at levels that protect him as much as they protect the information. What I can tell you is this. The human diplomatic service placed him in technical roles not because his skills are limited, but because his skills needed to be contained in environments where they could express themselves safely. The engineering, the systems analysis, the ability to understand how complex structures work and where they fail, all genuine, all real. Also the civilian application of capabilities that were originally developed for purposes that were not civilian. Valeth's bioluminescent patterns were cycling, the rapid chromatic processing of a mind integrating new information with existing understanding, and finding that the integration produced a picture larger than either component. He checks exits, every room we enter. I noticed in the first week. I thought it was a habit. Yes, it is not a habit. It is an assessment. Continuous, automatic, operating below his conscious awareness. He does not know he does it. He does not know that his positioning relative to you, always on your exposed side, always between you and the most likely threat vector, is not preference but programming. He does not know that the engineering skills you admire are also the vocabulary his mind uses to assess structural vulnerabilities, infiltration routes, and tactical options in every environment he enters. You knew, Valeth said, and the words carried not accusation but realization, the recognition of a pattern that had been present since the selection and that she was only now seeing complete. When I chose him, you knew what he was. You approved the selection because you chose a partner whose gentleness is genuine and whose protective capability is deeper than gentleness. You chose someone whose conscious self is exactly the caring, thoughtful person you wanted, and whose unconscious architecture makes him the most effective guardian you could have. I did not arrange the selection. I did not guide your choice. You chose him because of who he is. I approved because of what he also is. And the combination, the person you wanted and the protection you need, is not a contradiction. It is a complement. Valeth was quiet for a long time. Her bioluminescent patterns settled slowly into a configuration the Empress had not seen before. A deep, warm violet threaded with gold that carried the chromatic quality of something being understood at a level where understanding changed not the facts but the framework that held them. He doesn't know, Valeth said. No. He doesn't know he protected me last night. He knows he took your arm and showed you a bloom display. That is his genuine memory of the event. The tactical response was executed by architecture that operates below his awareness. He experienced it as impulse, the feeling that you should be standing somewhere else, the instinct to move. He attributes it to attentiveness. He does not know the attentiveness has a source that predates his engineering career. Do we tell him? The Empress considered this with the weight it deserved. That decision is yours. He is your consort. The information I've shared with you is the boundary of what I can disclose without violating classifications that protect him. What you do with it, how you integrate it into your relationship, is yours to determine. Valeth stood. She walked to the chamber's viewport, where the light of Ithara Voss's morning sun cast the palace's crystalline architecture in amber and gold. And she stood there in the light that made her silver-blue skin luminous and her bioluminescent patterns bright. And she thought about a man who fixed broken things, and who stood between her and danger without knowing he was standing, whose gentleness was real and whose capability was real and who existed as the product of both, a person and a program, a partner and a protector, both genuine, both present, one known and one hidden. And the hidden one had saved her life while showing her flowers. He fixed a relay, she said quietly. During the selection, that's why I chose him. He was surrounded by warriors and diplomats and enhanced specimens, and he was on his knees fixing a broken relay, and his attention to it was the most genuine thing in the room. Yes, the attention that I found genuine, the focus, the way he sees how things fit together, the way he understands systems, that's the same architecture, the same capability. Expressed differently, but yes, the same fundamental skill, the ability to perceive how complex systems operate, where they are vulnerable, and how to address the vulnerability. He applies it to communications relays because his conditioning directs it there. But the capability itself is not about relays. It is about understanding, and the understanding operates on everything, including your safety. Valeth turned from the viewport. Then I chose better than I knew. You chose exactly what you saw, the Empress said. A gentle, focused, honest person who pays attention to the things that matter. What you did not see, what I saw, is that the attention goes deeper than you knew, and the things that matter include you, in ways that his conscious mind calls love and his unconscious architecture calls primary protection directive, and both of them are telling the truth. Cole was in the household's technical bay when Valeth found him, recalibrating a climate control sensor that had been producing inconsistent readings in the eastern wing. He was seated at the workbench, the sensor's housing open, its internal components arranged before him in the precise layout that his methodology required, every piece in its designated position. the arrangement reflecting not just the order of disassembly, but the logical architecture of the system itself. A spatial map that allowed him to see the device's design philosophy while he worked on its mechanical reality. He looked up when she entered. The expression that crossed his face was the one that Valeth had come to recognize as her favorite expression in any species. The softening of his features when he saw her, the way the analytical focus that characterized his work gave way to something warmer when she was present, a transition so natural that it was visible as a physical change, the face literally reorganizing itself around a different kind of attention. The sensor, she asked, sitting beside him at the workbench. Thermal drift in the calibration module, common in this model. The compensating algorithm degrades over time and the readings start oscillating. He showed her the component, a small module that he held with the precise, gentle grip that he applied to everything fragile and functional. I'm resetting the baseline. Should hold for another 6 months. Valeth looked at the component. She looked at his hands. She looked at him, at the dark blue eyes that were steady and warm and that carried, beneath their gentle surface, a depth of awareness that she was only now beginning to understand. He was perceiving her the way he perceived everything, completely, thoroughly, with an attention that cataloged and assessed and responded to what it found. The perception was not threatening, it was protective. And the protection was not a choice he made, but a condition he inhabited, as fundamental to his existence as the gentleness that overlay it, and that was, she understood now, not in contradiction with the capability beneath, but in partnership with it. The kindness and the vigilance operating together, each one making the other possible. Cole, she said, yeah. Thank you for showing me the cascade blooms last night. He smiled. The smile was genuine, uncalculated, unrehearsed, the expression of a man who remembered a pleasant evening with the woman he had accidentally become engaged to in a ceremony he still did not fully understand and who he had, over the weeks that followed, come to care about with a depth that surprised him because he was not accustomed to depth, and because the caring operated at levels he could not fully access and that manifested as a constant background awareness of her presence and her safety that he attributed to falling in love, and that was, in fact, both that and something else, and both of them were true. The root structures were incredible, he said. The way the bioluminescent pathways integrate with the nutrient transport system, it's not separate engineering. It's the same system serving two functions. The beauty is structural. It's built into the utility. Valeth watched his face as he talked about root structures and dual-function engineering and the integration of beauty and utility. And she heard what he was saying, and she heard beneath it what he did not know he was describing himself. A person whose visible warmth and invisible capability were not separate systems, but the same architecture serving two functions. The gentleness structural, built into the protection, each one making the other what it was. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. She reached across the workbench and took his hand, the one holding the calibration module, and she held it with the deliberate, sustained contact of someone who was choosing to hold on. Cole's fingers closed around hers with the precise, gentle grip that he applied to everything fragile and functional, and the grip was both gentle and protective, both at once, both